Buonasera a tutti. Iniziamo questa nuova sessione della International Smart City School. Oggi abbiamo il nostro ospite, il professor Jacopo Torriti dell'University of Reading. Lui, il professore Torriti, è professore di economia e politica energetica presso appunto la Scuola dell'Ambiente Costruito dell'Università di Reading, e oggi insomma ci illustrerà alcune delle sue principali tematiche di ricerca che sicuramente interesseranno anche i nostri partecipanti, che fra l'altro sono anche impegnati nelle tematiche energetiche, per cui prego professore, le diamo la parola, l'ascoltiamo volentieri.
Thank you, Mara, and thanks for inviting me to give this lecture. The title is Demand-Side Flexibility, Shifting the Timing of Electricity Demand. Given that this lecture is primarily about time, I will do my best to stick to the time which I've been given. This is a topic that has been that I've been researching for a few years, and a version of this lecture, which was really my professorial inaugural lecture 2-3 years ago, is also available on YouTube, I should say. So what am I going to cover today? I'm going to speak about peaks in electricity demand. So first of all, I will introduce what they are, what the peak problem is. So as a way to introducing research around understanding peaks. The second part of this lecture is on flexibility, so ways to mitigate peaks, and I will focus on individuals, so basically how individual consumers can reduce peak demand or be more flexible in their energy consumption, on activities, and the last part of this lecture will focus on winners and losers. So those consumers that might financially benefit from flexibility measures, and those who may not. Okay. First of all, what are peaks, so.
Scusi professore, mi perdoni, non sta condividendo la presentazione?
Mi dispiace. Allora ritorno e adesso ci dovremmo essere. Ok.
Ok, confermo.
Okay, so thanks for saying it quite upfront, because I wouldn't have made any sense. So what are peaks? This is about people doing a lot of stuff at the same time, with different intensities, but throughout the year we experience peaks every evening. It's mainly about people finishing their daily activities, work, and so on, and going back home, and then starting activities in the home, while commercial and industrial loads are still present. So basically, it's a moment of societal synchronization. It's a moment of everyone doing things at the same time, and you can almost say that peaks are a signal or a proxy for how synchronized society is. A few years ago, I wrote a book published by Routledge, Peak Energy Demand and Demand Side Response, where basically I explain my passion for peak energy demand, and some of the measures or flexibility measures which have been deployed over the years, and the research which has been done to mitigate peaks. But why are peaks a problem? Okay, we understand that it's about people doing stuff at the same time, basically demand coming together. In the UK, where I'm based, there is a typical association of a lot of demand and potential for blackouts. It's particularly the case in winter, where energy demand reaches its highest peaks. There is a lot of emphasis on, oh, what if the lights go out and we experience blackouts and things like that. We kind of addressed these in another book which I wrote with colleagues, which we called Energy Fables. So this fear of the lights going off, or basically having too much demand that supply cannot meet, is more of a mediatic fear than an actual concern for system operators or those working in this area. I'm going quite fast, so if in case the translator wants to come in and tell me to slow down, I'm happy at any time to do so. Okay. So peaks in electricity demand bring about significantly negative environmental and economic impact. So if you like, this is the main issue with peak demand, is that historically, in order to meet peak demand, dirty old power plants which are not used, like say during the night or in the morning, or when renewables are on, would have to be activated and basically match in order to match supply and demand. In the future, the peak problem is expected to be exacerbated by the fact that we'll have more intermittent renewables in the supply mix, and the fact that electric vehicles and electric heat pumps will go and replace current like fossil fuel or gas transport and heating. Okay, so the electrification of transport and heating represents a challenge, and there are several forecasts in several European countries telling us that peaks in electricity demand are expected to increase in the future. Okay, so this is a premise to say that research on understanding peaks has its own value, and what this is something. So it's important to look at secondary data. It's important to understand the timing of peaks and how they vary, for instance, across seasons. So this is British national electricity demand data. The different lines represent different months of the year, and you can see the blue line representing February is the one where the highest peaks occur, and then there are other months like July and May, which have significantly lower peaks. I just coming back to the sort of social media expression, or social media obsession with the lights going off for Christmas, since we are around that time of the year now. Is quite misplaced, because whilst residential demand is higher than on any typical month or day of the year, a lot of the non-residential loads are not happening. So it's very unlikely that if there is a day in which you have ever a blackout because of too high demand, that wouldn't be Christmas. That would, I mean, at least in the UK, that would probably be in February, which happens to be when my birthday, so I don't want that either. Okay, so a few graphs to enter a bit more the peak problem, if you like. So this is data which we have collected at the University of Reading along in collaboration with energy industry partners. It shows in two different years, so 2014 and 2015. It shows uh, basically a week of consumption in an urban area. And you can see, and the pink areas in all graphs represent the peak period, which in this country where I'm giving you the lecture from, it happens to be between 4 p.m. and 8 p.m. in the evening. Okay, so what you have at the top left graph is really the demand, so electricity demand in megawatts for these different days in 2014 and 2015. So blue line representing 2014, red line representing 2015. And you can see basically the peak periods, especially for weekdays, always being happening there around that time of the day. Um, the um, the bottom left graph shows day ahead wholesale price. So basically, it's a price of electricity at different times of the day. And you can see here we have 3 years, the yellow line representing 2016. You can see that during peak periods, prices for electricity are higher. Okay, now we don't see that necessarily in our bills because they're typically flat, like an average of what our supplier would be spending to buy electricity in the wholesale market at peak time and off peak time, and then it's kind of averaged out. But that's in a sense a real time price of electricity for the system being significantly higher during peak periods. And then, so we said it's peaks are bad for the economy, peaks are bad for the environment. So the bottom right graph shows you the again for these 3 different years, the carbon intensity. And I mean, there are 2 things to say. One is that fortunately, with time progressing, so like the yellow line for 2016 stands much lower. These are CO2 emissions of the grid, and the reason being that with more renewables on the system, the carbon intensity of the grid diminishes. Okay, so that's good news. The other thing to observe is that there is a certain tendency for peaks dragging carbon intensity up, and this is precisely because you may still have renewables on the system. In the evening, obviously, solar photovoltaic solar generation goes down. We might still have quite a lot of wind turbines on in the evening periods. I believe that would be the case if not throughout the year, but for quite a lot of time in Sardinia as well. Um, and but you need demand is high, and so you need like gas-fired power plants or like a sort of fossil fuel, dirty old power plants on in order to meet demand. Okay. So we come to, okay, so what do we do research-wise to understand peaks a bit more? What kind of data do we have to understand what triggers peaks and how to mitigate them? So if you compare a weekday and a weekend for the same household, you would probably be experiencing similar weather conditions, assuming it's around the same time of the year. The building fabric of the household will not have changed. The very material, insulation, thermal capacity of the household will not change between the weekday and the weekend. The very appliances and devices which are inside the home will not change between a weekday and a weekend. And the price, provided that you are on some sort of flat standard flat tariffs, so your bill will not change, or how much you are charged per kilowatt hour will not change between the weekday and the weekend. However, if we look at this rather strange 24-hour clock that I come out with some smart meter data just for a single household, you see the red line represent the electricity demand of that household during a weekday, whereas that sort of gray on my screen, grayish area or cloud consists of the electricity demand of the same household during the weekend. So it's a 24-hour clock, which and is also not very well. I must say, I have colleagues who have done a better job with this with this kind of graphs than me. But basically, you could track down, this household probably wakes up at 6 a.m. or their boiler system starts ticking in at 6 a.m. and then with the red line and goes to bed fairly from 10 p.m. or so, things start going down. So this is to say, this example, there's a lot of energy demand research focusing on weather, building fabric, the efficiency rating of the appliances, and price as a way to explain energy demand. The obviously, that research is extremely valuable to understand the volumes of energy demand, how much energy demand is consumed in a month, in a year. That's excellent. However, if we want to understand more the timing of energy demand and how it varies intra-day, or within a same day with a fairly granular resolution, like what happens every hour or so, these variables or this type of data is not that useful. So what would we need to know? What changes between the weekend and the weekday are people's activities. So weekday activities are very different from weekend activities, and that explains why in every home consumption looks very different between a weekday and a weekend. I would push this proposition more by saying that if we knew on a sort of consistent basis the timing of people's activity, what they do on a regular basis, we would know more about what triggers energy demand in every home. And this is what we've been trying to do, I would say, as a research team. So I'm co-director of a Center for Research into Energy Demand Solutions. It's a National Research Council funded center where we lead the flexibility theme. So we have some 7 to 8 projects looking precisely at what people do and what we can infer about demand side flexibility. The example I have here is basically entering the type of data we use. So it's data on what people do. It's in jargon, it's called time use data, and it's basically data that is collected in typically by national statistic offices, but there are various ways of collecting, including at a smaller scale. So the example here is in Belgium, for instance, and you see in the table, bottom table here, you have a country, Belgium. The start time, this is 4 a.m. So like in the middle of the night, or early, very early morning, 4 a.m. to 6 a.m. And unsurprisingly, you'd say most Belgians at that time of the day, what do? They sleep. So so this is the type of data we use. Of course, we don't just look at the nights because there's not so much surprise there. But we look throughout the day, and we use data, connecting data on people's activities with energy demand. Okay, so just looking at the time use data, this is UK time use data. You can then start doing all sort of, classifications. Like for instance, men and women have different work patterns in the UK. So one could say it has to be really careful, because when I present this type of data to energy suppliers, like over here, Électricité de France or EDF is quite a big supplier. You go there and their marketing team starts jumping up and down saying, I know we need to, market tariffs for women, because what it shows is that women are at home earlier in the afternoon. This is because several of them are on part-time jobs. And so in a sense, they start triggering the evening peak earlier. In this country, schools typically finish at 3:30 p.m. or so. And then you can see how people start moving home at about 4 p.m. And that's what triggers the evening peak. So yeah, very careful with that. Obviously, there's nothing about women being more picky in their demand. Is really the structure of everyday life, and the structure particularly of the labor market, which means more men are working in the office. I mean, especially in pre-COVID times, the data relates to. You can also look at differences between households with children and those without children. So, for instance, those with children tend to do everything earlier in the day. Quite a lot, of a fifth of those with children at 5 p.m. Is still working, whereas at 5 p.m. a quarter of those without children, so a more significant proportion is still at work. The great thing about this data is that not only you end up knowing when people do things, but potentially also where. So we made use of a specific data set, which is used also in telecommunications, which has GPS information around where people are, so what they're doing, when, and where. Very much Big Brother, right? So basically, you can project. There's a map of Britain, and you can project where there are people using computers. This is a much smaller sample than the ones we typically use. This is about 3,000 respondents, whereas the big national time use surveys with diary data tend to be something like 15,000, so a statistically representative portion of the population. Okay. Now moving on, so we can in principle, through input-output modeling, it is possible also to derive what the greenhouse gas emissions are. For instance, in this case, for men and women. Again, this is just based on consumption at home. So it doesn't take into account travel or what consumption happens in the workplace, okay? So for instance, higher home occupancy reflects higher greenhouse gas emissions. So this is why you see women having higher greenhouse gas emissions in this specific graph. The work we do is not just UK specific. So for instance, we looked at peaks in electricity demand and occupancy in different countries. So you can look at, for instance, households which have at least one active occupant, so someone who is at home and not sleeping, and compare taking everything to Central European time. You can compare basically the rhythms of demand, or at least residential electricity demand, in different European countries. So these 3D graphs tries to capture that, like what percentage of single or solo, like one person occupant you have in different countries. And then you can do some interesting comparison, for instance, between Germany and the UK. So this is, again, what is the probability of having one or more active persons doing some energy-related activity. And you can look at Germany on the left and the UK on the right. The various colors represent things like the big blue is watching TV, orange is cooking. And it's quite interesting, speaking about cooking. There's very different patterns between Germany and the UK. So Germany has a stronger peak around midday or lunchtime, and that's because they tend to cook more their food. They have hot meals for lunch, and whereas they tend to have cold meals like dinner in the evening. And it's the opposite in the UK. There's a very packed lunch tradition of you eat a cold sandwich for lunch and then prepare a hot meal in the evening. These shapes peak demand in the two countries significantly. Okay. Then you could say, okay, you can look at how things vary spatially, like in between countries, but also in time or across decades. So collaborated with a statistician at the University of Southampton, Ben Anderson, and together we looked into different time use data for different decades from 1976 to nowadays. So the graph here shows national grid half-hourly demand data. So it's actually electricity demand data, and you can see that the darker gray is closer to present, so it's a year 2016, whereas the lighter gray is 2006. So just a decade, but in just a decade, we can see that evening peaks are happening later. And this is particularly visible in the month of July, where you have quite a lot of shift in overall national demand to later in the day. Okay, so that's a shift. And so we're interested in looking into time use data with a view to understanding what has changed in what people do between 1974 and 2014. So in general, in the UK, everyone is eating later than they did 40 years ago. You have reduced use of evening media. So you have that household care tasks have been shifted from weekdays to the evening peak period, and so these, society changes and the timing of when we do things changes, and that will have effects on when evening peaks in electricity demand happen. Okay, all right. So you could say, okay, one way of seeing these is by looking at individual behavior. So you could think, okay, there's something about how do you go about what people do. If you give them more information, like through the so-called smart meters or contatori digitali, just to help with the translation that we have in Italy as well. This is an in-home display, so something you can keep not just where the the electricity meter is, but in the living room or in the kitchen, and it would tell you how much consumption is happening real time. So there is quite a bit of work in the sort of psychology of behavior, of how to shape individuals' behavior. I would tell you, if you give people information about energy consumption, about the money they're spending, or about the environmental consequences of energy demand, like CO2 data, they would then, for instance, reduce consumption at specific times of the day, because they have been made aware of the implications of their consumption. Okay, so there's one approach would be to look at individual behavior and say we could flex or reduce peaks by, for instance, introducing higher prices during peak periods, um, giving more information about consumption at peak time, or more information about, say, the CO2, the carbon emissions at that time of the day. Another approach is to look at what are known as social practices. This basically comes from an observation of typical everyday life. So starting from the home, and by the way, we didn't speak about morning peaks, but there's quite a lot of that in most countries, where people turn things on because they need to get ready for the day before then leaving, or leaving the home and going to various places. For instance, a family would drop the kids to school. Then a few others would go on and go to a workplace, and spend most of the day in doing work activities before again traveling back to their home. um, and so social practices are basically the study of how everyday life is structured, and how it evolves over time. Okay, so it's taking not the individual, but more like society as a whole, and that has a certain power in order to understand the timing of energy demand, and indeed peaks as a form of synchronization, a form of how we do everything together. So this is to introduce then what we do, what research we do on flexibility. And basically, okay, up to now, we've understood what peaks are made of, or the activities that constitute peaks. But how do you go about reducing peaks, or shifting demand? The end game being so that you would have a better sync, or a better coordination between, say, renewable supply and energy demand. So flexibility is often introduced in the space or in energy systems as a win-win. So people say, and when I say people, these are the timeline at the bottom of this slide shows a few important reports which were produced by industry, government, and research in the UK over the years. And the bubbles represent the estimates of how many gigawatts of flexibility would be required in different across different time scales. So a bigger bubble means imagining a world where demand is really more flexible. So flexibility is a win-win because it would improve balancing with renewables. It would reduce the costs of electricity generation. Imagine not having to turn on all those dirty old power plants, but being able to cope with a lot of renewables on the system. That would really reduce the costs of balancing significantly. And also, it would be about making the most of smart systems and battery storage. So in a sense, innovation and imagining a future which is more flexible. So flexibility is typically viewed from two standpoints. In a sense, is okay, you can introduce tariffs and pricing schemes that enable like a reduction in peak demand. So the example would be things like time of use tariffs, where people are not charged a flat average price for their bills and their energy bills, but they would be paying more for peak consumption and less for off-peak consumption. Second view is would be a future where everything is more automated, where the home and I think a lot of smart city narrative also fits in here. Where you're leaving the office and your mobile sends a signal to the home, and the heating system turns on. We already have commercial applications of that. This is why I made this example. Like Nest, or the Italian examples escape him. I know my sister has one of those. And so a more automated, more technological future in which flexibility issues are resolved through more automated platforms. Okay, the research is often a bit less developed in understanding the implications for families, everyday life, and in a sense, where would flexibility feature in the everyday life that we living. So something on price, just to explain a bit more, explain the time of use tariffs. These tables explain. I think if you focus on the graph there, which has time and unit price, so the horizontal axis represents time. Now we are familiar with the 4 to 8 p.m. Evening peak period. So most of the tariffs we are familiar with are flat, like the blue line, so you're charged the same for any time of the day. Whereas the time of use tariff here is made of 3 colors because what you would pay in terms of euros per kilowatt hour would vary depending on the time of the day. So on a weekday, the red line between 4 and 8 p.m. means you're paying much more for peak consumption. So if one follows the approach number one, let's say that we explained earlier about the individual and behavior, one can look at in terms of price elasticity of demand. So economists like to use these terms like how elastic is demand to changes in price? How much does demand reduce if we increase price even for a very short period? When I was at the London School of Economics a few years ago, we worked quite a lot on these type of issues and constructed sort of fancy models to choice experiment, or how would people in principle respond to higher prices. Won't spend too much time detailing these, but I think the key takeaway, which I have from this slide, and apologies if I'm rushing a bit this part, but the point I want to make is that you see the green highlight there, the variable that matters the most in those analyses is how easy it is perceived to introduce this type of time of use tariffs, or how easy it is to flex, how easy it is to change everyday life. That's the thing that has the highest discounting, as we would call, as economists would call it. So you're willing to be paid less for shifting if shifting is easy for you. So this points to the importance of the second approach, which is about everyday life and social practices, and how life is constructed. So the work we do is clustering. So clustering based on what people do at peak time, and then imposing different time of use tariffs on different socio-demographic groups and those clusters that we created, and that's with a view to understand a bit more about flexibility, but also the potential for automation and everyday life. So these are various projects that have been funded to look at these specific aspects. So this graph shows the comparison of peak and off-peak activities. Remember, peak activities take place between 4 and 8 p.m. Off-peak activities any other time of the day. And it's basically like a ratio. So how much more of happens at peak time compared with off peak? The one activity that comes up The highest is cooking. So cooking, because it's evening, and people cook at that time of the day much more than than the rest of the day. That has a really high ratio. Okay. And that applies a bit to also different, look at mm, different household composition. So like people living by themselves, single or single parents. The single parents come up as really high in terms of cooking at peak time. And you may think, how on earth will they be able to shift that if they are by themselves and having to cook for children, right? Means that household without children also have quite a high level of cooking at peak time. So these graphs go a bit deeper into, showing, for instance, for income level on people on different income levels. The blue line representing low income, the red line high income, how much they cook and when during the day. And so you see that, really depending on the so you have cooking, active occupancy, and watching TV. And low income households, there might be people really staying home all the time if they're unemployed, or retired and not on a high income. This animation shows you the clustering we do. So it's basically saying, you are in a cluster, like you see now, cluster 6, cluster 7, cluster 8, and so on. You're in a cluster if so those in your cluster are those that do the same things at peak time as you do. It doesn't matter which income you are. It doesn't matter, how big the house you are in. And at the bottom, you see what that cluster typically is made of. So what type of family, what type of employment, what type of house, what the house is like a house, a flat. And so we have these clusters, which are useful because you're basically telling you those who do more at peak time and would potentially be more disadvantaged if we had tariffs which really penalized peak consumption. So our next step, I'll probably skip this too, is to we modeled energy demand from the activities. So we are not the only ones. There are many other European researchers, for instance, in Sweden and Denmark, who do similar modeling. So from knowing the distribution of activities, coming out with the load profile or the electricity demand of that specific household. So we did that to then basically attribute some power demand to all the different clusters. So you can see that we have 20 clusters, and those are, in a sense, the median and average power demand for each of the clusters. And then, as I promised, I said, okay, let's see if they were on time of use tariffs, who would be the winners and who would be the losers, who would benefit from these type of tariffs, who would actually be losing out. So this is just the type of time of use tariffs we used. Again, you can see between 4 and 8 p.m. they have a higher price per kilowatt hour than during the rest of the day. And this is, in a sense, what we found to be the winners and the losers. So you have on the horizontal axis all these different types of households, and those that are winners in green there are, for instance, um, so families with 2 children, or bigger households with 5 people. And so you have a bit like a kind of breakdown of different household compositions to understand those who would be winning or losing from this time of use tariffs. To be noticed losers includes single parents. We are not surprised because they tend to be quite time constrained. And so looking after kids while doing quite a lot at peak time, and many of them working the rest of the day. Okay, and then we looked at how the different clusters would be, whether they would be penalized or advantaged from this type of tariffs. So for instance, you see, okay, cluster 3 and 11 would lose out, cluster 20 and 9 would be better off, or they would be winners if they had time of use tariffs. So all these, in a sense, to understand what? To understand, so power to the flexible people. What happens to those who do not have the time and means for demand flexibility? So some reflections that, there would be some who are left behind in this transition. The importance of time and non-energy arrangements. So basically, when we go to work, when the shops are open, when school is on, really matters for understanding peaks and what flexibility we might have. And then the issue of what we call like the single mother nurse. So we noticed the analysis shows that single parents who are working and are on a lower income are likely to be are likely to lose out from these flexibility tariffs. And so there are, in a sense, policy questions around how you protect consumers like these. I managed to, with a bit of rush looking at the time, but I am coming to an end of this. So there are some references which will be there with you since you have the slides package. And I really thank you for this opportunity to present my work and give this lecture.
Grazie a lei professore, complimenti insomma per questa interessantissima presentazione. Penso che sia un tema assolutamente importante e che la sua ricerca sia in qualche modo la base per aprire dei tavoli di concertazione anche più ampi, perché lo spettro del ragionamento deve certamente coinvolgere sicuramente tutte le istituzioni o comunque i soggetti che insomma hanno la responsabilità anche nella organizzazione della vita delle persone, perché noi chiaramente ciascuno di noi deve rispettare delle tempistiche che sono anche imposte da un tipo di lavoro, insomma da protocolli, quindi diciamo che il nostro comportamento è dettato anche da scelte che non sono solo nostre. Quindi la sua ricerca, i dati che avete prodotto, il quadro di riferimento che abbiamo già come base, che avete costruito, io penso che sia proprio una base di partenza per iniziare un ragionamento anche coinvolgendo altri organismi decisionali, immagino, insomma, altrimenti.
Yes, thanks, Mara. And I should say one of because we speak to, let's say, politicians or organizations which in principle could have a role in, let's say, changing the structure of everyday life in a way that suits an energy transition with more renewables on the system. It does boil down to either you have a ministry of everything or the way a lot of like how governments are organized are quite in silos, where a ministry takes care of transport, a ministry takes care of energy and environment, and so this cross thinking is something that is typically missed out. We're not alone though. So for instance, we partnered with Électricité de France, and in France they did a whole analysis of how electricity demand changed in various parts of France because of shop opening times. So we know that these correlations exist and that they really matter. We are a bit behind in advising how to change on that, and in that the research is still, if you like, not that mature.
Sì, un'altra preoccupazione è che, se magari, insomma qualche anno fa, c'era una tendenza verso la condivisione di alcuni servizi, anche di modalità di vita che vedevano parte della giornata, in condivisione con altre persone. Sono nati anche tipologie architettoniche e funzioni urbane, appunto, destinate proprio a portare la visione, insomma, di vita autonoma verso invece una propensione alla condivisione di momenti della vita quotidiana, anche di servizi della vita quotidiana e della propria abitazione. Io immagino che proprio quell'esperienza che poteva essere molto utile da perseguire in un momento come questo di fronte ai dati che ha mostrato lei, purtroppo con la pandemia ci sia stata un blocco di quell'esperienza. Forse la pandemia invece ci ha riportato a riacquisire autonomamente tutte le nostre funzioni, di svolgere la nostra vita in autonomia, perché in qualche modo siamo stati bloccati in questa propensione alla condivisione. Quindi lei pensa che appunto la pandemia abbia determinato questo cambiamento anche da questo punto di vista?
This is a very valid reflection. We are working in collaboration with the University College London, and the time use data they collected during, before, during, and after the lockdowns here in the UK, with a view to understand particularly the role of work as central to so many of the activities that we do in our everyday life. And we're looking at the energy implications of that. But of course, there is a question of, so I don't have an answer yet, but the intuition goes that with work missing, or the workplace not being the centerpiece of everyday life, you would precisely have that desocialization, if such word exists, or a sort of desynchronization of the social, and a drive towards the individual.
Esatto, sì. E quindi immagino che anche nella gestione dei picchi questo sia un problema, insomma, perché, insomma, ciascuno, insomma, ha, necessità di, sfruttare quell'energia, appunto, senza condividere più con nessuno alcune esigenze, quindi, fa tutto in autonomia. Okay, io chiederei ai nostri partecipanti se qualcuno, insomma, vuole fare qualche riflessione o ha delle domande da porre al professore. Chiedo alla regia se ci sono delle mani alzate.
Nessuna mano alzata.
Ok, allora noi ringraziamo tantissimo il professore per questa presentazione. Sono sicura che insomma la riascolteremo anche nei giorni successivi per rivedere anche la metodologia che avete utilizzato. Grazie ancora.
Grazie, buona
Speriamo di
giornata.
averla anche nelle prossime edizioni.
Vi ringrazio.
Arrivederci, buon
A
lavoro.
presto.
Arrivederci.